1940 was one of the most supremely important years in comic books history as the amount of content exploded, especially with superheroes from publishers all across the spectrum. We're going to take a look at not only the books that have the most copies on the census, but a lot of other keys and see how their relative scarcity or rarity compares to those books. Up next on this video from Bronzeville Comics. Hello, panelologists. This is Jim from Bronzeville Comics coming to you with another video. Before we get started, please like, comment, subscribe. Check out the description for my whatnot, my Instagram, my eBay store, and my email. You can reach me on those methods. And we're going to talk about the year 1940 in comic books. Superman came along in 1938 and really started the golden age of comics and the superhero genre. In particular, Batman premiered in 1939, and our top 10 list is dominated by those characters. And it's really interesting, and I'll talk about some specifics about that as we go through the list. DC was king of the roost at this point. And we'll see a lot of first appearances from a lot of different publishers of a lot of different characters. And it's interesting to note how many copies are on the census. Let's just start in at number 10 on the list, and it is a copy of New York World's Fair, 1940. This is the second issue in the series. The 1939 issue was the previous year, and this is the title will become World's Best and then World's Finest Comics. It was published by DC Comics, and it starred Superman and Batman and Robin in separate stories. They did not team up for years, well into the 1950s in this title. It also was a 100-pager, so it's a thicker book, and it starred, as we can see here, Sandman, Slam Bradley. If we look at the description from the CGC, it also had Johnny Thunder and Zatara. It was basically a way for DC to showcase some of their more popular features or features that they wanted to put into the spotlight. 132 copies of this in the census, and that's kind of a good basis where we're going to start. 132. It's over 100. And as we move up in time, we're going to see more and more copies on the census for more and more books, just because books are more plentiful. These books were printed in, if not the millions and the hundreds of thousands, but time. They were disposable. Paper drives during the war kind of soak them up. So again, we're talking about the CGC census, and we're only talking about universal blue labels. We're not talking about restored. We will mention restored when it comes to some of the other titles because that's important, including number 9 on the list. And this is a book kind of surprising that it's down that far, but then again, not. It's a copy of Batman number 1 from the spring of 1940. This classic cover, the first appearance of both the Joker and Catwoman in this book. There are 148 universal blue labels on the census, but it's also worth noting there are 154 restored copies. Batman and Superman were really the two big stars at the time, and it makes sense that they had their own titles. They published a lot of copies of that, and people saved it because they recognized who the characters were because they appeared in newspaper strips, in radio serials, in movie serials. They had other merchandise with toys, etc. So these were always the two of the most well-known characters of the time. Batman number 1, of course, and I'm not going to talk about values at this point in time because I don't think that really is important. All these books have value, and they at a certain price point they're going to get graded. So 148 blue labels in the census plus 154 restored. If you add those two together, this would pop up to number 1 on the list. And the books that are more valuable are more likely to have restored copies because number 1, 60s, 70s, 80s, etc., before CGC, dealers were trying to make the books look better because these were their pricier books, so a little trimming here, little color touch there, and they were able to pass them along as nicer looking copies. And whether or not collectors as a whole we're concerned about those what we call now restoration methods is up for debate. But that is, you're going to see that, and we're going to talk about that with some other big keys, which there were plenty of them in 1940. Number 8 on the list, and we're going to continue right along. It's a copy of Batman number 2, second appearance of Joker, second appearance of Catwoman, known still then as the Cat. 154 copies of this book on the Census. People try to build the Batman run. It is because Batman was only coming out, and you can see in the upper right-hand corner, summer issue, was only coming out quarterly, 4 times a year, as opposed to Detective Comics, which was 12 times a year. And for collectors, you get entirely Batman stories in this book, maybe other than like a one-pager, comedic relief, as opposed to Detective, in which you had one Batman story, and then you had a lot of other characters in there as well. So let's go to something that is related as we go to number 7 on the list. And it is a copy of Superman number 5, the summer issue. Superman was published quarterly until the end of the year, and it went to a bi-monthly schedule. And there are 156 copies of this book on the Census. I don't think this is one of the better Superman covers of the time. But we'll see some of the other ones. So issue number 5 comes in at number 7. Going to number 6, and this I think is a better cover, is issue number 3, the winter issue, with this amazing cover by Joe Shuster. There are 164 copies of this on the Census. Again, blue labels. You see that kind of Art Deco train, the motion in this image. The yellow cover, which is very popular. We saw it with Batman 1. We saw it with the previous issue, Superman 5. It is something that they did use a lot. I guess it, caught attention on the stands. So this is the winter issue. Issues 1 and 2 were from 1939. This is the first 1940 issue. Let's go to number 5 on the list, and it's Superman number 7. This is the first appearance of Perry White. I don't think that's really going to drive the value of the book, just the fact that this is Superman number 7 from 1940. That's what drives the value of this book and why people submit it if they have it. There are 177 copies on the Census of this book, and you'll notice in the left-hand corner below the S it says November, December. So by now it was on a bi-monthly schedule. There are 5 issues of Superman that came out in 1940 with cover dates of 1940. Let's go to number 4 on the list. And this is a copy of Superman number 6, another classic yellow cover with the signature down here. There are 205 copies of this on the Census. And I do note not every book has been submitted. There are collectors who are completely raw collectors, especially people who have large pockets and just want the books in their collection and maybe want to actually read them. So I know I see on Facebook in a group that I follow, Billy Mummy, the star of Lost in Space, is a big comic book collector, has a lot of big Golden Age keys, including some of the books that we'll see on this list. And he's completely raw collector. Even the recent Christine Farrell collection, the complete DC collection, that was completely raw until she passed away, and then the books went up for sale and they started getting graded. So yeah, there are, I don't know what the percentage of these books are. So there are 177 blue labels on the Census. I actually have a copy of this book that was too fragile to encapsulate, so I actually have to get it conserved because it is very brittle and very acidic. So that's number 4 on the list. I'm sorry, there are 205 copies of this on the Census. 205 copies of Superman number 6. Let's move on to number 3. Number 3 is Batman number 3, the fall issue. 213 of this on the Census. This is the first time that Catwoman appears in costume. She has like the cat's head mask. It's also the first appearance of the Puppet Master. Another classic cover. Bob Kane and Jerry Robinson cover and art. I'm going to lean more towards Jerry Robinson and Bob Kane doing the art on this. In this black cover, just a really classic Batman book, and it's number 3 on the Census, on the 1940 list with 213 on the Census. Now let's go to number 2, and we're keeping very much a theme here. It's Superman number 4, which has 216 copies on the census. This is the second appearance of Lex Luthor. That is not Lex Luthor on the cover running away, because Lex Luthor had hair back in 1940 when he was, which they kind of did as the Earth 2 Luthor later on, Alexi Luthor, to separate him from the bald Earth 1. But he did become bald pretty soon thereafter. I think just somebody mixed him up with the Ultra Humanite and made him bald at some point. At any rate, 216 copies of this on the census. And let's wrap up the top 10, because honestly, the top 10 isn't as interesting as all of the other books that didn't make the top 10. Number 1 on the list, the book that has the most blue labels from 1940 is, and I have to find it on my list. Oh, here we are. Is Batman number 4, the winter issue. There are 217 copies on the census. It just edges out Superman 4 by 1 copy. And this is the 4th issue of Batman from 1940. So the top 9 books on this list are all Superman and Batman. 4 issues of Batman came out in 1940, 5 issues of Superman. That's the list. That's the entirety of the top 9. No detective and no action has made the list. So I don't know if these were printed heavier in 1940. I imagine they were saved more because they had these classic heroes in the title. And you can see this is the 4th issue of Batman, which has the most copies. It's the newest, the most recent. I don't know if that has anything to do with it. I mean, in terms of Batman, they go in reverse order in terms of the number of blue labels on the census. Now, number 1 is a breed apart. So, 1 World's Finest, 5 Supermans, 4 Batmans make up the top 10 list. What's left? There's a lot of stuff from 1940, so we're going to kind of use this cutoff of 132 copies to make the top 10. 132 copies on the census. There are a tremendous amount of books that did not make the top 10. One that just missed was, at 12th, Walt Disney's Comics and Stories number 1, this classic Donald Duck cover, 116 copies on the census. This was the first issue in a title that ran for 740 issues all the way through 2015. And, you know, this is a very collectible property. Walt Disney, people have saved Disney stuff since 1940 or before, so that kind of accounts for this breaking into the superhero stranglehold at the top of the list. We go down to number 16 on the list with 109 copies. Action Comics, number 23, the first appearance of Lex Luthor. That's not Lois Lane on the cover, by the way, and we'll address that in just a minute. This is the first time we see an Action Comics issue in the on the title. I love that 10 cents logo, that very, you know, that parallelogram. That's really kind of cool, with this enormous trade dress and the motion that's conveyed in it. So just also a great cover. But the first appearance of Lex Luthor, which was one of the major first appearances of 1940, one of the major first villain first appearances that is separate than the hero first appearances, much like Joker and Catwoman and Batman 1. But Batman number 1 is going to drive itself anyway. This book gets pumped up by the fact that Lex Luthor's in it because it is more valuable than, let's say, Action Comics 22 or 24. Let's go to number 21 on the list now with 85 copies on the census. And this is a copy of Action Comics number 27. First appearance of Lois Lane on the cover. That's her in the back left there, being saved by Superman from the Lion. And again, this is very early. And it says half-page ad for All-Star Comics number 1. Not even number 3, and we will get to that. Again, 85 copies on the census. Up next is a huge, enormous key. One of the biggest keys of 1940 in terms of its desirability and its value. And it's Detective Comics number 38, the first appearance of Robin, the Boy Wonder. There are 83 copies of this on the census, and I also make note. So it's about 50 copies short of making the top 10, but there are 68 restored copies. Again, first appearance of a major character. They're going to be more restored copies. If you add those together, you're at 151. You just be, you know, kind of scraping in to the top 10 at number 9. So even with that, and this predates Batman number 1 because he was on the cover and in all but one of the stories in Batman number 1. It is from April of 1940, so it came out, I think, a month before Batman #1, and it's a major key, but there aren't as many copies of it as any of the 4 Batman issues from 1940. Talk about sidekicks. We haven't talked about any timely. There's not a lot of timely first appearances in 1940, but one of them is in Human Torch #2, which is actually #1, which is the first appearance of Toro, his sidekick. 80 copies of this on the census, almost as many blue labels as Robin. Obviously, Toro isn't as big a character, and from the Silver Age on, the only interaction people had with Toro was in reprints or as a member of the Invaders. And Toro's, I don't think he's ever been in live action. Might have been in animated somewhere, but not nearly as big a character as Robin, but we'll see. Human Torch Submariner premiered in 1939. Captain America and Bucky premiered in 1941. So Timely didn't have a lot of first appearances. They were, I don't think, quite as aggressive as in jumping on the superhero train as DC and some of the other publishers were. DC was going in with both feet. Some of the others we'll see. They were kind of hedging their bets with superheroes and mixing them with humor. We'll see that as we go through. Let's go to another issue of Detective Comics. This is 33rd on the list with 70 Universal Blue labels. This is Detective Comics #40, the first appearance of Clayface, the original Clayface, who was not a mud monster, but more an actor who specialized in disguise, much like Lon Chaney. But this also has key significance as the first cover appearance of the Joker. Again, there are 70 copies of this on the census, just a hair fewer than the number of first Robins. And, of course, this would be his 4th appearance. And they're still giving him the green cape like they did in Batman #1. They hadn't quite gotten their, notes all together. Let's go to another publisher. And we're going to go to 2 books that are tied for 38th on the list. And one of them is by MLJ, which later became Archie. And this is Shield Wizard Comics #1. And it's the origin of the Shield and the Wizard, a flag cover. The Shield is really the first patriotic superhero. He predates by a year Captain America. And did he have a shield? He was a shield. I don't know. Any rate, MLJ magazine did become Archie Comics about a decade or so later. And this is his first appearance with 66 copies on the census. Also with 66 copies on the census, another enormous key, All-Star Comics #3, the first appearance of the Justice Society of America. And it's interesting, the only one of these characters featured on the cover that we've talked about so far was Sandman, who premiered in 1939. We will talk about the other 7 members of the Justice Society here, because they did not premiere. They premiered in 1940, all of them, but there are not as many copies of their first appearance as there is All-Star Comics #3. There's 66 Universal Blue labels plus another 55 restored. Even if you add those 2 numbers together, you're not making the top 10 list. There are fewer copies of this, all told, than the number of copies of New York World's Fair 1940. Let's go to the next book, and we're going to another publisher which didn't really include superheroes. They had a lot of other genres. It was Fiction House, and this is Wings Comics #1, 57 blue labels on the census. And you see Soul Squad, Phantom Falcons, Parachute Patrol, and Suicide Smith begin. Fiction House ran into the early 1950s. They had Jumbo Comics and Jungle Comics, and they had Sheena. They had Planet Comics. And this was one of their major titles. There's still a good number of them, 57 on the census, and let's compare that. Almost as many as All-Star Comics #3, and more than the next book on our list, which is another ginormous key. This is a book that in higher grades has sold for over $100,000, and that's Flash Comics #1. The first appearance of the original Flash, Jay Garrick, first appearance of Hawkman, and the first appearance of Johnny Thunder, as well as the Whip, and Cliff Cornwall and Shara Saunders. Again, an enormous Golden Age key from DC. 48 copies on the census, blue label, plus another 41 restored. But again, you put those 2 together, that doesn't get you into the top 10. It barely breaks into the top 20. So this book, compared to those Batman and Superman books, is much harder to find. You'd need, to almost double the number of copies, both blue and purple labeled together, and then double it to try to start to crack into the top 10 list of 1940. Let's go to another publisher, and we will visit this publisher a little bit later. It's Fawcett Comics, Fawcett Publications. This is Nickel Comics #1, the first appearance of Bullet Man, 43 blue labels on the Census. And what's interesting about Nickel Comics is they were nickel. All other comics were a dime, other than the biggies, like that World's Finest 100-pager was 25 cents. This was half the size. Instead of, I guess, 64 pages, it was 32 pages. And so it was thinner. And it came out every other week. I guess Fawcett was trying to do something a little unique. We'll get back to Fawcett a little bit later. And I think if you know a little bit about comic book history, you know why. We're going to go to 67th on the list. And this is an interesting one. This is also from MLJ. This is Top Notch Comics #9, the first appearance of the Black Hood. One of these superheroes, much like the Shield, that MLJ still owns the rights to. DC has published stories. Archie Comics has published stories of this character. It also has Roy the Superboy. Look at that guy. His little short pants and his purple mask. You know, his mom dressed him kind of funny. But this is the first appearance of the Black Hood by MLJ. There are 43 universal copies on the Census. Let's go to another timely comic, 69th on the list, Marvel Mystery Comics #8. Not a first appearance, 42 copies on the Census, but a sought-after book because this is the first of a 3-part story with the, and you can see it on the left-hand side of the cover here, Human Torch battles Submariner, an epic event in comic book history at the time, and really the first time that we saw two characters interact with each other. This does predate All-Star Comics #3 by, I don't know, about 5 months maybe. So, again, a really important issue, but what's funny is that's the main attraction of this book, but we get the angel as the main part of the cover. And I'm trying to see, cover art by Carl Burgos, the creator of Human Torch. Again, there are 42 copies on the Census. Let's go to another book, which is a pulp character, Green Hornet #1 by Holyoke Publications, the first appearance of the Green Hornet and Kato in comics. He was a pulp and radio star, and was, you know, an important character throughout. And this was by Holyoke Publications. He's had a TV series. He's had a movie. 41 copies of this on the Census. Let's go to DC first appearance, and a great cover to boot. This is Adventure Comics #48, the first appearance of Our Man. 36 copies of this on the Census. You're now almost 100 copies less than what it needs to make the top 10. Major first appearance, harder to find, Bernard Bailey cover, and he was one of the founding members of the Justice Society. Again, 36 copies on the Census. That is tied with Silver Streak #6 by Lev Gleason, which we don't see him here. I don't even know if there's a mention of him. This is the first appearance of Daredevil. Daredevil, who had his own title for Lev Gleason Publications for years. This is a Jack Cole story cover and art. Jack Cole, creator of Plastic Man. And so just, yeah, another with a claw here on the cover. Daredevil became pretty much the superhero at the forefront of Lev Gleason Publications. Let's go to 96th on the list with 35 copies on the Census. And this is a classic Alex Schomburg cover. This is the first time that Submariner is on the cover. And it's the first time we see a Nazi flag on the cover. So, you know, it's not out of proportion like later Schomburg covers, but it is, you know, very much war-related, even though this came out early in 1940. This is almost 2 years before the U.S. entered the war in Europe. And so it's kind of interesting to see Submariner battling the Nazis here, where America was kind of letting that percolate over in Europe and not wanting to get involved. So, again, 35 copies on the Census. Also with 35 copies on the Census, another major first appearance. And this is More Fun Comics number 55, which is the first appearance of Dr. Fate. Does have a Spectre cover by Bernard Bailey. But Dr. Fate, of course, a major character. 35 copies on the Census, plus another 22 restored. Again, even if you add those numbers together with 57 books, you're almost 100 books shy of making it to the top 10. So we're down into the low 30s on the number of copies. And we're going to go to a book that has even fewer copies, at least blue labels in the Census, which is an enormous key, a gigantic key, right? Am I in the right place? Yes. Up next, Whiz Comics number 2, which is really number 1. The first appearance of Captain Marvel. Captain Marvel would become the biggest seller of the Golden Age. At his height in the mid-1940s, he was selling more issues than Superman. He remains to this day. DC sued them out of existence, essentially, saying that he was trademark infringement of Superman. And DC did a lot of that back in the late 30s and early 40s. You know, he's throwing a car, just like Superman did in Action Comics number 1. He has the cape. He has the powers. A little bit different origin story, but it's also the first appearance of Savannah, Golden Arrow, Spy Smasher, and Ibis. But this is all about the first appearance of Captain Marvel. And there are just a scant 33 Universal Blue Labels in the Census. 33. Right? You'd have to quadruple that number to get into the top 10. There are another 30 restored copies, but still, that's only 63 copies of this graded in existence. There might be some conserved, I'm not certain, but that is really interesting. Now this ties with another book, which is not a big first appearance book, but is a number 1 with a classic cover. It is Hit Comics number 1. It's the first appearance of Hercules, Neon the Unknown, the Red Bee, X5 Super Agent, and Blaze Barton. This was by Quality Comics, and it has this great cover by Lou Fine. Lou Fine actually made the Red Bee look cool. And you can see the Neon, the Unknown is on the cover as well. I think is that Neon? Maybe that's not Neon. Is that Neon climbing out of the water? No, that's probably a bad guy, right? Like a pirate. At any rate, the Red Bee dominates the cover. Quality, we'll see more Quality Comics coming up, probably more in 1941. And one of the things about Quality is those characters were eventually bought by DC in the 1950s, and they continue to this day. There have been different incarnations of the Red Bee in All-Star Squadron in the 40s. You know, in the 80s, Roy Thomas did use the Red Bee and Neon the Unknown and some of the other characters. But then that has 33 copies in the Census. Another book with 33 copies in the Census. Hard to find book. And another enormous, gigantic, fantastic key. All-American Comics number 16, the first appearance of the Green Lantern, Alan Scott. Another founding member of the Justice Society, 33 copies on the Census, just like Whiz Comics number 2, and also 30 restored comics, just like Whiz Comics number 2. So those books are equally as hard to find. And, you know, we're getting down here into the 30s for these major comics. And again, if you have a copy of this, unless you're a dyed-in-the-wool raw collector, this is a book you're getting graded. Period. End of story. Let's move down. Number 145 on the list, with 28 copies on the Census Universal Blue Labels, is Shadow Comics number 1, the first appearance of the Shadow in comics. Much like the Green Hornet, this is Street and Smith Publications that he appeared in. The Shadow was a pulp hero, had a radio series in the 1930s, and is a character that still is around today. Has not yet gone into public domain, but will soon. As we move on to 180 on the list, Exciting Comics number 1, which is the first appearance of The Mask. This is a book from Nidor Publications, who also had characters like Black Terror. Alex Schomburg did some work for them on covers in the 1940s during the war, and this is one of their early books, and there are just 25 copies on the list, which is tied with Smash Comics number 1, or I'm sorry, Smash Comics number 14 from Quality Comics, which starred Bozo the Robot and also had Invisible Hood, and this is the first appearance of the Ray. That was one of the superheroes that DC acquired when they acquired Quality Comics and was a member of the Freedom Fighters that premiered in Justice League 108, had their own series in the 1970s. The Ray had a series in the 90s, and he was used in the Flash TV series as well as one of the characters in a crossover episode. So, moving to 199th on the list. We're going way down. And this is All-American Comics number 19. This is the first appearance of the Atom, Al Pratt, who is not in costume in this first appearance. And we can see in the bottom right-hand corner, beginning in this issue, a brand new feature, The Mighty Atom. Green Lantern was still the featured character in All-American Comics. And this particular book, there are 24 copies on the census. Just 24. Remember, 132 to make the top 10. Now, the next book on the list is an enormous key. Very expensive. Even like mid-grade is probably a $100,000 book. And this is More Fun Comics number 52 from February of 1940. So it's early in the year. The first appearance of the Spectre. That story art and the cover by Bernard Bailey. This is the first superhero feature in More Fun. And it's kind of interesting because the Spectre isn't a traditional superhero, right? He is a ghost. But he was a founding member of the Justice Society of America. There are only 22 Blue Label copies on the census. There are an additional 30 restored copies. That seems to be the popular number because there are also 30 copies restored of Wiz Comics 2 and All-American 16, but 30 copies on the census. So even if you put the two together, and there are 52 total copies on the census, you're still 80 copies short of making the top 10 for 1940. So this is a very, very hard to find book. This is the biggest key that's this far down on the list, because the Spectre is a fairly major DC character that's been in print pretty consistently since the mid to late 60s, and of course was one of the staples of the Golden Age, and again, a founding member of the Justice Society. Let's go to 241st on the list with just 21 universal copies. Another quality book, National Comics number 1, the first appearance of Uncle Sam, who was created by Will Eisner, and the cover here is by Lou Fine, who also did the cover of Hit Comics number 1. Again, created by Will Eisner, Uncle Sam, 21 Universal Blue Label copies on the census. We're going to keep going down further and further. At 261 on the list with just 20 copies on the census is Crash Comics number 4 from Tem Publishing. Its first appearance of Catman, who was a fairly important Golden Age character. You can see this one features Strongman the Perfect Human. I'm pretty sure this was one of those guys that got sued out of existence by DC in protecting the trademark of Superman. And another quality comics up next, which is 19 copies on the census of Crack Comics number 1, which is the first appearance of Black Condor, another member of the Freedom Fighters. And most of the other characters here, you know, Jane Arden and The Clock and Wizard Wells and Madame Fatal and Ned Bryant are not superheroes. So Quality was kind of dipping their toes in tentatively into the superhero game, whereas DC was going in full force. And we'll go to one more book. We're going to go way down on the list. This ranks at 416th on the list. There are only 14 copies on the census. And this is Prize Comics number 1 from Prize Publications. And it's the origin and first appearance of Frankenstein. You can see here over on the left. And right below him, it's the first appearance of the Green Llama, who is a Golden Age character that did maintain some popularity amongst collectors, especially because his stories and covers of his own title were drawn by Mac Raboy, one of the more popular artists of the Golden Age, who's best known for doing Captain Marvel Jr. So that's going to wrap it up for 1940. There are a lot of crazy books on this list, but it's interesting. The books that have survived the most are Superman and Batman, period, right? All 9 Superman and Batman comics from 1940 are the top 9 on the list in terms of the ones that have the most copies on the CGC census. The only book that would break into that, if you include the restored books, is Detective Comics 38, the first appearance of Robin. But, I mean, just the major characters' first appearances, you got Robin, you got the Spectre, Dr. Fate, and Captain Marvel. I mean, major first appearance, and Green Lantern and Flash and Hawkman. And the fact of those, that there are less than 40 Blue Label copies on the census for most of those first appearances, is kind of astounding. So that's it. We're going to, for this week, 1940, we're going to move to 1941 and a bunch of other great Golden Age first appearances. What's going to be number 1 on the list? I don't know yet. I haven't done the research. So come back next week and see what makes number 1 on the list. Same bat time, same bat channel. Meanwhile, you can take a look at a couple of my other videos here, and this is Jim saying until next time, enjoy your comics.